Welcome to another episode of The Breakdown. We're continuing in our conversation on Danielle Smith's hate legislation. There's really nothing else to call it. And today we're going to try to change the conversation a little bit. We've had a lot of conversations with academics. We've had a lot of conversations with advocates and activists. But today we're going to talk directly to somebody who is a member of the community that is being targeted by Danielle Smith and this legislation. So, without further ado, I am so excited to welcome to the show. I'll be honest, I didn't know if we were going to be able to get her when all of this kicked up. I was like, oh, I hope we can, but I didn't know if we were. And I'm very excited to welcome to the show. Activist, advocate, sometimes writer is how I'll phrase it, and Canadian certified inclusion professional. Marni Panas. Marni, thank you so much for joining us today.
I'm so excited to be here with you, Nate. Not necessarily excited about what's happening, but pleasure to chat with you.
Yeah, it's the circumstances are, I feel like we could generously call them suboptimal, and be understating it by a lot.
I would call it violent.
Yeah, and we're going to get into that because that is a real component of sort of the fallout of a lot of these conversations that have been enabled and emboldened by leaders like Danielle Smith. But before we get into all of the gross, horrid stuff, um, I, I want to introduce you to the audience with more than just the little ticky boxes that I had there. So, who is Marni?
Oh, that's such a great question. I'm a lot of things. Like I'm a parent to two amazing boys. One had passed away, and my other little kiddo is not so little anymore. So I'm a proud parent. I'm a partner to an amazing human being that I adore. I am a professional. I like to run. I've been a student. I've been a teacher in many ways. Sure, an activist in many ways. An amazing neighbor. I'm a lot of things. I think, hundreds of adjectives used to describe me. I happen to also be trans, but that's not the one thing that defines me. I'm defined by all the ways that I interact with society and how I engage with people around me. So we're a lot of things.
What makes you a good neighbor? I'm curious. Are you like a lawnmower lender, or is it what are the criteria we're using
I,
there?
I should have asked that of my neighbors to qualify that, but generally, we've got such a great neighborhood where I live, which is really important from a safety perspective. But sharing a meeting, saying hello, you know, shoveling the sidewalks, getting the sidewalk shoveled, sharing food, and just a friendly smile and a hello. During pandemic, I had to spend a lot of years working from my home, so we got to know a lot of the neighbors through beyond the windows during that time, and I'm really grateful for that.
So I want to, as much as you're comfortable talking about, what was your, I'm going to word this as broadly as I can so as not to do a big thing badly, but can you sort of uh, explain your trans journey?
Yeah, and I think that's great. Every journey is different, every journey is unique, and every journey is valid. I grew up in Alberta. I'm an Alberta girl, born and raised, and not too far from Edmonton, actually, in Camrose, Alberta. At a time when we didn't have internet and we didn't have more than two channels on TV. I often joke that my two channels were on and off growing up. So we never had the language to articulate how I felt. I never heard the word transgender until I was in my 30s. But I was born into a very conservative community with a Ukrainian Catholic family that also had very clear gendered roles and expectations that were very clearly defined. Yet I also knew that I didn't fit into those roles. I liked exploring a lot of other things, but I also knew very early on and at that time that if I was to deviate from those expectations, it'd be quite catastrophic for me, quite frankly. And you get really good as a child to keep your secrets, and you really get good at being alone because that's where your secrets are safest. And so, because it wasn't again until I was in my 30s that I started to understand the language and seeing myself reflected in that language. And so it wasn't until, decades later that I started to realize who I am. And I actually completed well, this portion of my transition. I think we're always in transition, to be honest. But I was working at the Stollery Children's Hospital at the time with an amazing group of people who were in the business to care about our patients and families and each other. And I felt if I can't be me here, I can't be me anywhere. And that was a really big part of my transition is really understanding who I am. And I had a supportive spouse at the time and a child who loves me. And at some point, Nate, you get to a place where what you fear losing by being true to yourself and bringing people into your truth pales in comparison to what you will lose if you don't. And that was the tipping point that I found in my life in later years. And so, that began that journey of living authentically. I'm still evolving, I'm still changing as we all are. And so I'm still evolving in that space. But that kind of gives you a sense of where I've come from.
Now, there's a question I'd like to ask you about sort of the story that you just shared there. And it is, you said that you knew from a very young age, but you lacked the language. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so again, I never heard the word transgender. There was an expectation of being, an expectation that I was a boy, and all the roles that were very clearly defined for a role that, even in a family that, that had again those clearly defined roles. I couldn't tell you who I was. I could just only tell you who I wasn't. I wasn't that boy. I just couldn't tell you who I was because I didn't have language to articulate that what that was. And I think that's really important in today's context because there's a lot of rhetoric out there that says, there are a lot more trans and non-binary youth all of a sudden because of ideology or because they're being, forced or what have you. There's been this many trans people in the world as long as there's been people in the world. That we've been, trans people, non-binary people have been around for thousands of years. Just think about indigenous communities have had for all that time. What's different today for a lot of youth is they have role models. I didn't have role models. I didn't see anybody on TV who looked like me or came from a similar background. They have language to talk about who they are and supporting adults in their lives who are sometimes teachers or healthcare professionals or other folks in their lives that make it safer to share who they are. There's not any more of us. There are just more people who feel a little bit safer, or at least we did until recently, being true to ourselves. That's the difference.
Yeah, and that's kind of what I wanted to try to pull out of you a little bit there, because one of the things that's struck me as the peak privileged person that I am, um, has been, we do hear that argument be presented. Well, it seems like there's more trans people, but you can take a look at any time in human history where people have identified, oh, we didn't know that was a thing. Like you can talk about autism or neurodivergent
Mhm.
stuffs. Everybody went, oh, it must be the vaccines. Or maybe we've just learned to recognize it and not call that person odd. Maybe we've learned that there's more to the human experience than just this simple state. And I think that it's unfortunate that part of the language piece is part of what's being attacked by this new set of policy suite that Danielle Smith has announced, because one of the pieces in this is attacking the language and the education piece. And I'm let's get into the Danielle Smith policy stuff. So I'm going to come back to the education piece, but have you ever had, I mean, Danielle Smith says she's broadly consulted with, at least from what we can tell, three people. Have you ever had any conversations with Danielle Smith or the UCP government? I mean, you are a Canadian certified inclusion professional. Have you ever had any meetings with her about any of this stuff? Has she ever reached out to you and said, "Hey, am I about to do a big thing badly?" Or have, yeah,
Well, the answer is yes, but there's an asterisk there. I was on her show years ago when she was on her radio show, long before or in between her stints in government, and I'll never forget that experience because we were talking about Bill C-16 at the time that would add gender identity and gender expression as protected grounds under Canada's Human Rights Act, and I was invited on the show to talk about that a little bit, and the conversation went fairly well, and then as soon as I hung up the phone. then she pretty much trashed anything I had to say, but didn't give me the chance to speak to it. And I will never forget that because I said that would be the last time I'd actually ever appear on her show because it was just such an awful experience from that perspective. So that's the only time I've actually ever talked to her about that was on her show, and I just didn't feel it. It was very respectful. And so, no, the answer is no. And I actually don't know anybody who has been consulted. And by that, I mean, lived experiences are absolutely important. And we have so many organizations that are out in communities supporting trans, non-binary people, their families, healthcare providers, educators who that's their job to understand these things, to use the research and evidence to my knowledge. Well, she's not been able to show anybody if that come from any of those backgrounds. So whether she has or not, certainly hasn't shown that she has.
Yeah.
And
And
when
well,
asked and pressed, she doesn't share what the evidence is, other than platforming a few people that has seems to be the driving force behind this.
and I think it's important to highlight, like in the conversation with Dr. Christopher Wells that we had, one of the things that he emphasized is you can be anything in this conversation. You can be trans, and you can also have a whole lot of unresolved trauma and unresolved other issues. And one of the things that I asked Dr. Wells was, is it incumbent on anybody who's attempting to write any sort of policy or explore any sort of policy on these issues to make sure that the people who are speaking to these issues are not coming from a place of active trauma, but rather coming from a place of informed, evidence-based policymaking? He said yes. I'm going to speculate, but I'll ask, would you share that same position?
Oh yeah, absolutely. I think we recognize that a lot of us have experienced various levels of trauma, and so forth. So we have to do a trauma-informed approach to engaging these conversations, 100%, and exploiting the trauma. And I don't want to sit here and diagnose anybody because I don't know
Sure.
anybody else's experience. I just want to qualify that. But in general statement, to exploit people's ongoing active trauma for political gain not only harms an entire community, but that individual as well. And that's why it's a challenge to media as well, is to do your homework on this as well, because you could be perpetuating a harm that is really something to consider.
Danielle Smith has said in the past, oh no, we'll never do anything with any of these issues. She was very, very clear repeatedly. And we saw a lot of pundits, professionals, experts in some fields say in the run up to this announcement that blindsided everybody, um, she's not going to do that. Danielle Smith is a lot of things, but she's not going to do that. It's like the worst Meatloaf song ever. Uh, but she did. And we saw on the Saturday, a couple weeks ago, she made the oblique announcement on the radio show. Yeah, we got a suite of policies. We're going to be announcing them soon. And then came I think it was a Wednesday where the video dropped. I'm just curious if you can kind of share a little bit about how did you find out? When did you find out? And what was your reaction to the announcement in the video?
Yeah, first of all, I think for those of us who have experienced this level of anti-trans, anti-LGBTQS plus, anti-gender rhetoric, anti-feminist, all the things, I do see this coming. I often say we're always only one election away from losing rights that we fought so hard for, and that's the message I've been saying for years. You ask anybody in our community, I think they'd be shocked, or they would be um, not one person would be shocked to say that there were policies and changes coming out. We saw that at their AGM. It's a whole platform that the UCP was built upon, was these kinds of things. So none of us were surprised that something was going to happen. I will admit that I was one of the first to be surprised at how draconian they are and how cruel, frankly, cruel these things are. That surprised me. I knew something would come, but it surprised me. How did I find out? I was busy at work, and all of a sudden, a whole bunch of media were all calling me at once, and some friends and some physicians who I know. Everybody is hearing it all at once, and my phone was just coming off the hook, and I started to separate and I started to answer them like, what's happening? Clearly, there's something going on. And then I watched the video, and I have to say, I sat at work watching the video and had some colleagues around me, and I just broke down into sobs. Like, it was uncontrollable sobs. Fortunately, I work in an amazing place with people who care around me, not knowing what was going on, stepped in to give me a pretty good hug and show of support. But it was a shock. It was a shock. It was because all the things that were said in there were direct attacks, were not true, and were intended to demonize and dehumanize trans people and non-binary people, and based on ideology and nothing that had any background behind it, and it felt very personal because it is personal.
I just want to re-emphasize what you just said there. Um, I mean, Danielle Smith went out of her way to produce that video with we call it the timeshare sales video here on the show because it was a nice soft background. There's some soft lensing and soft lighting, and look, there's guitar music, and all it was missing was Sarah McLachlan. But the policies that were delivered, despite that soft framing, were uh, like I just feel like it needs to be said again. The impact on you when you heard that as you broke down sobbing. Like that should speak volumes about how harmful and toxic these policies are.
Yeah, because I knew what that impact would be to others. And I've since heard from a lot of parents and people that I work with who were phoning me, like, who didn't even know my own background, just but in the profession that I have, in tears because their child is now today, they were afraid to go to school. And my heart just breaks. I'm pretty good, Nate. I've got a lot of privilege, and I want to recognize that. I'm able-bodied. I'm white. I look like what a society says a woman should look like in a very binary world. I've got a great job. I've got supports around me. I own my own home that I don't have to worry about being kicked out of. I'm doing pretty good. And so if I'm feeling scared, if I'm feeling hopeless and helpless, I can't even imagine what people who aren't in my position are going through right now. But at the same time, I recognize that because of that privilege and that I have that, I can lend a voice and hopefully take on some of the burdens so others don't have to. That's the only thing I can think of to help cope with this.
I want to talk a little bit more. So you've introduced the topic, so I want to try to explore it. There is, I imagine, he said from like you think you're privileged. Let me tell you. Cis, straight, middle-aged white guy with tattoos. I'm the guy that people cross the street to get away from just because of how I look. So I have no illusions of my level of privilege either. And you acknowledge yours, so I want to acknowledge mine. But I do want to explore a little bit if you're okay with it. Um, you talked about the reaction of parents. You talked a little bit about your reaction. If you could spend some time talking about the reaction of the community and the people that these policies, I mean, to be clear, and the way that I've talked about it on the show before, Danielle Smith threw a great big target up on the wall, and at the very, very center of the bullseye is the trans community.
Yeah.
There's a lot of other circles on that target that I think she's hoping that people maybe don't look at quite so closely. Because, oh, but look at the bullseye. It's scary because it makes some people uncomfortable. Um, but the center of the bullseye is unquestionably the trans community. So, what have you been hearing? How, talk about how this has impacted the trans community to your I realize like not a monolith, and I don't want to ever represent any particular group as like everybody's the same because that defeats the point. But what's the reaction?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. So I think you're right. Right now, acutely, the direct and violent impact attacks are aimed specifically at trans and non-binary people, particularly youth in this province, as a bit of a deflection to a bigger issue. What's happening here impacts all of us. When you start to interfere with conversations between a healthcare provider and their patient, that impacts every single person. That impacts any, a government that came to power built on not interfering with government, with patient and provider access. And here they're doing exactly the same. That should concern everybody. When you start to limit people's ability to function in society, that should scare everybody. When you tell children that they cannot have a safe place to go to, that should concern everybody. When you talk about parental rights and caring for the child with that beautiful guitar music that you're talking about, at the same time directly harming children, right? So we have to recognize that everybody should be concerned about what's happening because it really impacts an entire society. Um, but that bullseye right now certainly is the target on trans and non-binary people, and to deflect away from talking about the opioid crisis, the fact that there's so many people experiencing that don't have homes or houses, that high energy prices, all of those things that are happening that we're not talking about, that we should be holding this government accountable. Instead, we're talking about less than 1% of the population, the deflecting from all the other problems that people should be thinking about. So that's that bullseye that you're talking about. I think it's a perfect analogy. The impact is real and profound. I heard from a lot of agencies that are supporting trans youth and in schools. And right now, there is such a big rise on the need for mental health supports and guidance over the last couple of weeks, like a huge rise, and not having the resources to support the peaking needs that a lot of children, youth. So that's happening right now, right? And you're hearing from a lot of healthcare providers who are scrambling to possible before things go badly for them. For me personally, in the week after the policies were introduced and that video was dropped, I personally received 3 death threats. One of them on my phone, two of them through email. So much so that that they are being looked into. I've experienced significant harassment, and with all those privileges that I have, privilege can be wiped out in one moment when it's the wrong person that recognizes me on the street, and I recognize that. And so, for the first time in my life, with all the things I got going for me, I feel less safe today. I am less safe today, demonstrably less safe today than I ever have been as a trans person living out publicly in the last 10 years.
And this brings us to another thing that I wanted to spend some time exploring a little bit is we have seen from Danielle Smith, certainly with this policy announcement, an emboldening of rhetoric, I'll call it, where she has, through these policies, perpetuated a bunch of myths. She's perpetuated a bunch of falsehoods, but she's also allowed people in her periphery without condemnation to really, really, really say some horrifying things. We saw her share a stage with Tucker Carlson, who repeatedly, throughout both of his shows, both of which she attended, made a lot of transphobic and homophobic jokes. We saw she has still, and this blows my mind, she's still failed to condemn David Parker, who regularly says profoundly hateful things. And it seems like to me, and this is what I want to get your take on, it seems like to me when you have people in positions of leadership who don't condemn this rhetoric, they allow it to become normalized. That literally does put people in these communities at risk because then the crazy angry people think that it's okay to be crazier and angrier. Am I reading this wrong?
Oh no, that's exactly right. In fact, the people that you're describing are the people who she needs on her side to keep into power, and that's the real scary part about all of this, right? And you're right. When you've got a premier, somebody in that type of position, to surround yourself with people and validating what they're saying, of course, it gives permission, a sense of permission for people to be more vocal. My worry, though, however, is that people are more emboldened to take what they used to think and now say it out loud, and for those that were quite fine to say it out loud, to move into action. And it is behaviors and actions that are terrifying. Well, we saw just a report today from CSIS that's warning that anti-gender movement, the so-called anti-gender movement, what we're talking about here, particularly that's embedded in policies, the things that the premier is suggesting and the people that's surrounding herself with, these anti-gender movement is possessing an extreme risk of violence aimed at the LGBTQ plus community coming up, and which will only see to increase over the course of the next year. This is CISA saying that because of what's being said, there's a credible threat and increased violence expected towards people like me.
I mean, when the security apparatus for an entire country is saying the way y'all are talking is literally putting people in physical harm's way, that to me should be. I mean, I would like to think that there's a moral imperative and a moral argument to say, hey, if somebody's being a horrid human being, you have a responsibility to say, especially if you have the privilege that allows you to do it, you have a responsibility to say, "Hey, you're being horrid, and it's not cool with me. I'm not going to hang out with you no more." That to me should exist enough for Smith to say, maybe I shouldn't share a stage with Tucker Carlson. Maybe I shouldn't validate David Parker. Um,
Honestly, Nate, I'm less concerned about her sharing a stage with Tucker Carlson or all these people. The real harm is embedding systemic violence against trans people in policy. She's got all the power to do that, and that's the power that terrifies me more than who she shares the stage with, because she's clearly informed by these things. But it's legislating discrimination against trans and non-binary people, legislating violence towards trans and non-binary people. That's what I'm scared about.
Dr. Dwayne Brad in our conversation did an excellent job of highlighting because I was trying to talk about the fact that we're editing press conferences now in the province of Alberta, and that seems pretty screwed, like little Orwellian. Um, but he pivoted from that and said, actually, what concerned me more was the answer that was edited out, where uh, the minister who was doing that press conference, Dale Nally, was like, we haven't had any conversations in cabinet yet. And that was 2 days before the day, sorry, it was the day before the announcement was made. So not only is it Smith is making these policies, she's proposing legislation, but she appears to be doing it completely uh, without engaging the other members of her own government, which is, I feel like there's a word for that.
Yeah, and I mean, who knows what and who doesn't know what? It's fine. It's the things that are being said publicly are one thing. What is being said behind the scenes that are feeding this, and that's and who are they listening to inform these harmful and quite frankly cruel policies. We as Albertans should all be concerned about that. It will impact all of us.
Would I be, in your opinion, would I be safe to say that the lack of condemnation of these views and the normalization of these views is putting people from these communities at legitimate risk of physical harm?
Yes, 100%. I mean, if I'm getting these emails directed at me already, and people that are, that's me personally again. Absolutely. There are children, youth who are scared to go to school in the mornings for fear of what is going to happen. Um, that's happening today. And so, and again, we've got credible resources like CISA saying this will increase because of what's being done. And and it's not only, trans and non-binary people, but when any person doesn't fit into what society says a woman should look like, cis women are at risk as well from bodies being policed. For example, the premier used an example of a rugby match to show why trans women shouldn't appear in sports, and shows this video of this individual being smacked down on the turf of a rugby field. As it turns out, it was a cis woman. So all women are going to be impacted by this in some way when we continue to police how women should look like in society or not look like in society. And so it goes way beyond the trans and non-binary people. And that's what people really have to understand here. It's not just about this 1%. We will all be impacted by this and already are.
Does that paint sort of a broad roadmap of what people who recognize this for being bad should do? I mean, if the normalization of the speech is contributing to this very real risk of physical violence, then and the lack of condemnation of the speech, does that mean that allies, to use the term, one of the things that they absolutely need to do is repetitively, no, once is not enough, repetitively and consistently say, this is some bullshit right here.
Yeah, and I think that's such a good important point, Nate, because again, we're a small community. Less than 1% of Canada's population identified as being trans or non-binary in Stats Canada, and I think, if I recall it correctly, and we're hurting. We're a small group and we're tired. We need allies to stand up and say enough is enough. We need people to stand up and for us and with us, because it impacts all of us. And when we start talking about body autonomy and talking about interfering in decisions made between healthcare providers and patients, where will that end? It has to end now. We have to take the stand on something like this now because it's just an ongoing erosion of rights. And it's that canary, that frog in the boiling pot. We don't realize until down the road that we've lost a whole bunch of things that are really core values to our being, and that's something that is going to impact all of us. That we should all be concerned about what's happening towards these attacks on human rights right now.
Well, I think for me, there's kind of two really big pieces that I feel like need to be highlighted with it as well. And I think the first one, former mayor of Calgary, Naheed Nenshi, he verbalized very effectively when he said, this is not how minority rights work. Because if you say it's majority rule all the time, and we're not going to worry about what the minorities, whether we're talking about the trans community or ethnic minorities or if you're going to say that it's just majority rule and screw everybody who's not in the majority, then you're endorsing trampling on the rights and the advancement of any minority. And I think that that's a really important piece to highlight because that's what's happening here. And I mean, you talk about less than 1%, but I mean, we're still talking about punching down on a minority or marginalized group um, for political gain. But the second piece of it is that's particularly striking, and I think a lot of people should be paying much more attention to, is like if you look at the depth and breadth of history, when you have leaders who start to punch down on minority groups, it's usually not a sign of good things to come. Um, do you think that those two pieces are things that people should be talking about or paying more attention to, or am I spreading things too thin?
No, no, I think you're absolutely right because it doesn't. It's not going to end here. It doesn't end here. It should end here. We should stop it here before it gets worse. So you're absolutely right. Nenshi is also absolutely right. Minority rights are there to protect minority groups from, quite frankly, the systemic issues of the majority. That's the whole point of minority rights. And we don't decide human rights by polls, by Angus Reid polls of all polls. Right? They're not just we don't govern that way when it comes down to human rights. I mean, what was it in a just before about 2015, 2016, nearly 80% of Canadians approved banning niqabs and hijabs. I mean, right? So if we went that polls, particularly polls from people who are not impacted at all by these decisions, we should not be governing that way. Right. When we think about I know they keep saying, 78% of parents agree with parental rights, but if they really dug into that, of those 78% of those people, I could say less than 1% of those people are actually impacted by anything that's happening in here. Why do we put so much weight on that?
Yeah, I always go back to one of my favorite lyrics from one of my favorite punk bands, and that's just majority rule don't work in mental institutions. So
That's a good point.
it's a little on the point, but it's what punk rock does. Um, I'm curious, you know, there's two other pieces that I want to get your thoughts on. Um, and I'll go to the comments. Like we're recording this on February 15th. Yesterday, Danielle Smith held a press conference and let loose one of the I still don't have the words to appropriately describe it. I keep coming back to one particular turn of phrase, but I'm told that that's not a good turn of phrase to use anymore, so I'm trying to avoid it. But she was asked about the former UCP candidate who's now sitting as an independent MLA, Jennifer Johnson. Jennifer Johnson, in the run-up to the provincial election, it was revealed that she had made some off-the-cuff comments that were horrifying, to be clear. And I'm not in any way trying to minimize or diminish the impact or the harm that those comments caused, because again, we just finished talking about the normalization of rhetoric. But she made some comments about, a few trans kids in the school system. I'm paraphrasing, but a few trans kids in the school system is like having a little bit of poop and some cookies. It ruins the whole batch. Now, Gross, horrifying, and Danielle Smith, some would say rightly at the time, after significant public pressure, said she will not ever be allowed in caucus. And then she said she's got some work to do. And then she said, no, no, never. And yesterday she was asked about it, and she said that there aren't any conversations going on in regards to letting her back into caucus, but she's got a lot of work to do. And then she said the thing that I want to get your take on, which is where she said some things that hurt some feelings in the LGBTQ, or sorry, she said LGBT plus community. Um, and she has to demonstrate that she's willing to make amends before she can play a role in government. I'm curious. I can't even get through it with a straight face. Um, what are your thoughts on that, Marty?
Well, the cognitive dissonance is strong with this one,
There we go.
right? And you're right. We laugh because what else are you going to do with something like that? And I think you're right. The words that were said at the time were egregious, and people need to be held accountable. It's not about silencing and canceling. It's about the fact is, you can say whatever you want, but there are consequences to doing so. And the consequences to this particular MLA was being removed from caucus and sitting independently. I think it was the right move at the time. Makes sense. And I think about that at the same time, their words are one thing to embed discrimination and into your policies. How can you call that behavior out while actually making it so much worse for trans non-binary people by actually embedding it into legislation to actually actively be okay to discriminate against, people like us? It's again, the cognitive dissonance is just it is quite astounding, actually.
It's wild to me that she'll say that Jennifer Johnson is not somebody who deserves to be in the UCP caucus, but at the same time, as she unilaterally introduced policies without cabinet or caucus feedback or feedback from the community, she's like, but I get to be premier.
Yeah, and I think that goes back to even the video that you talked about, that that beautifully produced and caring and emotionally evoking a video, and in there, and even some of the comments afterwards, we saying out loud, we care about you, trans people, we care about trans people in this province, we support you, you are welcome here. It's one thing to say that, but I'll tell you, I certainly don't feel cared for. I don't feel welcome here, right? So it's that, at the same time saying, we care about you, but we're also not going to let you exist in society. That doesn't feel like caring to me. I don't know what, I was taught about caring in a much different way, I guess.
Oh, I got well, two other things. I always do this. I'm like, just one more question. And then I'm like, there's three. But one of the things that Danielle Smith has tried to pivot to, and the silver lining that she's tried to paint around this abhorrent policy set is, um, because we're going to get better health care for people as adults. If we just wait for people to transition as adults and we get rid of the puberty blockers and we get rid of the hormone therapy, and apparently, as long as kids don't live out, then we don't need to notify the parents. That was another clip that blew my mind. But we're going to have the best care for people who want to transition as adults. We're going to attract a doctor who will do exactly what we tell them. Um, as somebody who transitioned as an adult, I mean, I don't think that there's any arguments against having better care for adults, but and I feel like I know the answer, but does that sell you on this policy suite? Or does it just seem like it's an incredibly disingenuous way to go? We know that we're never going to be able to attract a physician who's able to do these things, but we're going to say that we're going to. So it seems like we actually give a shit when we very clearly are just painting a target.
Yeah, I think one has to look at how healthcare looks like today, which is what we should be talking about for all Albertans, and seeing the track record there when we're hearing from a lot of physicians wanting to leave. How are we going to attract them? And maybe to use one of her phrases, I'm afraid of what could happen in the future, right? And I think so. And at the end of the day, I'll be honest, I would be actually terrified to go to a healthcare provider that this particular government would choose for me for specifically this, because I don't know what that looks like. And I think that's just a bit of of a red herring to say, hey, look, we're doing something good while the whole underlying system is falling around us. And quite frankly, Nate, I just hope these children survive long enough to access that really good health care that she's promising, because I don't think the harm that will happen before then is too profound and too great. And that is my concern, is that enough of these youth won't survive long enough to access that great healthcare she's promising.
Well, and that kind of speaks to the comments that she made on this week's radio show, where she said something to the effect of um, somebody was asking, a teacher called in and asked, "Hey, so if we have this mandatory notification piece for trans kids, that does put kids at risk." I mean, there was the study that said 62% of trans kids feel like they're well supported at home, but the flip side of that coin is 38% then don't. Um, and her response was, "Oh no, we'll only require the notification if the kids choose to live as out at school." Um, which, like, I don't know if she realizes that she's saying, "Well, just stay in the closet until you're 18 and everything's been fine," and how harmful that is. But I'm wondering if you could speak to that for a minute.
Well, whether she's saying that or not, that's what youth are hearing. And I think that's what's important, is the impact that it's having on youth like that, right? And that's when I think about, people don't understand. I think there's a lot of myths about what happens. It's not like a child transitions at school and the teachers and everybody, this big cohort, is keeping a secret for the 3 years that they're in junior high or high school. That's not how this works. They come to a trusted adult, like a teacher, maybe their coach, maybe a healthcare provider, to say, this is what I'm exploring. What do I do? And that trusted adult works with the child to find the right mechanism for them to come out and share, and maybe that's with family, and finding ways to do it. It's not like 3 years. These are days of conversations, or months. People don't understand that important interaction between the student and that teacher. So I think, there's a lot of misconceptions about how that conversation goes anyway. But if there's any thought that that child, now, the moment I say out loud to somebody that I'm exploring my gender, I don't know who I am, that they're going to be exposed to their parents immediately, uh, that is a real risk and a real concern. And of course, the message that we're sending to those children is, stay in the closet long enough, and hopefully you survive long enough to get the help that you need. And the evidence is very clear as well, that that first month or so, those first 30 days, around that time where somebody discloses or comes out, whether about their sexuality or gender, is the most critical time, where the suicidal ideation is the highest as well. And so, really recognizing acutely the mental health that they're going through, and the support that they need at that time, is really, really essential. Adding to that risk could be catastrophic.
I also think, and this is another thing I'd like to get your thoughts on. I think that there's like an insidious piece to the whole conversation around parental notification, because like I've got two kids, and if for some reason I'm, whatever the I'd like to think he said naively, that my kids know that they can come to me with anything and that they're going to feel safe and supported. I'd like to think that. But if for whatever reason at a particular moment in time, they don't feel that, as a parent, I would want them to find somewhere where they do feel safe and accepted. And if that's a teacher, cool. I don't have a problem with that. And it seems like there's this underlying message of, well, if kids go to teachers to talk about math problems, that's fine because math is okay. But if kids go to teachers to talk about issues of gender, or expressing questions about, their gender identity, am I trans, or I think I'm trans, or I don't know how those conversations go, because as we established earlier, I'm the peak cliche. But I would want my kids to have a safe place to go to have that conversation, because I don't believe that there's anything wrong with being trans. The subtext of this notification piece seems to be, if my kid goes to have this conversation with a teacher, I don't want them having the trans conversation with the teacher because that's bad. And that's part of the conversation that I feel like we need to have a little bit more because the subtext is very much if they're not cisgender straight, then something's wrong. And it's simply not true. And so I feel like there's a bigger conversation that we also need to have as a society about there's nothing wrong. There's nothing wrong.
Well, yeah, it's true. And it's funny, it's okay to go talk about math if it's about binary math. That's right. That's a little binary, non-binary humor there. Um, but I agree with you. I want my child to have somebody safe to go to. And if that person's not me, and I know there are some families who, have been so vocally open about gender and sexuality to their children. And even in those environments, some their children might feel scared. And rightfully so. I mean, it's a scary thing to come out to anybody. I was terrified. It took me years to find the courage to finally share. And as an adult, it was terrifying. I feared losing my job, losing my family, losing my life, all the things. And so it was terrifying for me. I can't imagine at 13 or 14 what that feel like. And so, sometimes that relationship with that trusted adult, whether it be a teacher or a healthcare provider, is to help that child find the language, the confidence, the support, some concentric circles of support around them so that they can have those important conversations with their families. And that becomes a tool of building relationship with family, not a division. And I think that's really what we've been seeing is that nurses and doctors and teachers have all been somehow are being villainized, not only in the concept of trans health, but in a lot of areas over society over the last number of years. And these are amazing people doing essential, good work. They're not the villains here.
I mean, to me, I just go back to like, I remember when I was 13 and 14, and the biggest deep, dark secret that I was ashamed of is that I was listening to Def Leppard. Uh,
Which I've taken my son to. I love a good Def Leppard. Um, totally, yeah, Rock of Ages and all that. Love it. So, I was just thinking though, in my life going back when I shared my news with my family, I was at 40 at the time, and I remember my mom sitting there looking at me and saying, "Why didn't you come to us sooner? Why didn't you come to us as a kid?" And I said, "If I would have told you sooner, what would you have done?" And she said, "I would have taken you to a doctor to fix you." That's the reality. That's what we feared, right? And that's what she said. And then she said, "Is there a pill that you can take? Is there any medication you can take?" I said, "Yeah, it's called estrogen, and I'm doing great. I'm happy now." Like it was. Do you know what I mean? And a lot of it is lack of knowledge, and I understand that environment. I'm not going to excuse their behaviors, but there's a lack of understanding and knowledge. At the same time, minutes later, my dad told me to leave the house and never come back, and I never have not seen them since those 10 years. But that was the reality, right? And that's why, I spent 40 years of finally being able to surround myself. I survived long enough to surround myself with great support so I can finally have that conversation. Best thing I ever did. Never looking back.
I just gotta, again, I know I'm highlighting things that you've already said, but it's just like as you were talking there were two things that stuck out to me. The first one is that was a conversation with a 40-year-old you.
Mhm.
So if that's the kind of conversation that you as a 40-year-old adult is having to navigate, the the conversation that you as a 13-year-old or a 14-year-old, I shudder to think. But the second piece that I think is important to kind of highlight out of that as well is the goal should not be, well, if you can survive until you can get to a place where you can deal with the rejection in the healthiest way possible, like framing the goal that way. And I know that's not what you did, and I'm not trying to suggest that's what you did, but when we're having a conversation about, if that's the goal, that in and of itself, I think speaks to how messed up the situation is.
Absolutely. And it's certainly not my goal. It's my hope. Like I
Yeah.
hope it
Yeah.
will go because right now that's what the message that's being sent, and that's what we're going to have to work with, and that terrifies me for these youth.
I have one last question, and I swear it's the last question, and then I'll ask another one. Um, how, taking a look at the history of the things, how lit is Pride going to be this year?
That's a really important question, Nate, and I don't know the answer to that. What I hope is that people who are planning Pride events this year understand and appreciate that not everybody's going to be celebrating. That Pride has always been a protest. It was born out of protest. It was born out of protest led by trans women of color. We cannot forget that. I'm not going to be celebrating. I can't. How could I celebrate when we are not safe? We don't get there until we all get there. So I hope people who are planning out the Pride events this year really understand that a lot of us aren't going to be celebrating, and we need to go back to those roots of saying, nope, this needs to be a movement.
I think it's going to be fascinating to I mean, because the as you said there, the history of Pride is protest, particularly by trans people. Um, but I think it's going to be fascinating. I'm really curious to see how the corporations respond to this,
Mm.
because Pride has, for the last few years at least, been a tremendous advertising, or it's been viewed by some corporations, I should say, as a tremendous advertising. Look, we're such good corporate citizens, sort of platform. And I feel like there's going to be a little bit more accountability this year. But it's going to be fascinating to watch all of the people who have treated Pride as a once a year tourist stop,
Yeah.
uh, to be told, to be met with a bunch of really rightfully pissed off folks. I think it's going to be a fascinating Pride season
Yeah, I
this
think
year.
so. And I'm fine with a lot of organizations showing their pride colors, and particularly for the employees who make up their place, it's important for them to see that their employer has their backs, and but that has to happen all year long, not just a pride. You have to earn your spot at Pride, I think, to be able to celebrate in that way. But I think it's really important to remember, and I want my allies there. I want people showing their pride flags. That tells me who I can go to, but you have to live those values. If you're going to be out there at Pride this year, if you're going to be celebrating and dancing, and I want you to have fun, I want you to be safe doing so. But I want you to live those values of pride all year long, because the fact is, Nate, that at the end of a hard day of oppression, of fighting for my very right to exist, I can't take my trans hat off and be cis for the rest of the night and put my feet up. This is my life 24/7. I don't get to walk away from this. People get to go and celebrate a pride and go home and to wherever they are and have a great time and talk about the fun that they've had. Those people who are experiencing the harms right now don't get to walk away from this. This is who we are 24/7.
Is there anything else that you want people to hear? Is there anything else that you want people to know before we wrap this up?
Yeah, I think when I think about the diversity, inclusion, equity, when I think about diversity, inclusion, equity work that I do, ultimately the core value that I have is you know, caring about each other, teaching people to care about the person sitting next to them, care about that neighbor, that friend, that person that's in your life who may have a trans child. Understand, care about them as a human, and the only way to get to do that is to get to know them at a human level. And I've really appreciated, Nate, today that you've created an opportunity for people to get to know the human behind the word trans. That just happens to be one adjective that is very, very targeted. But behind that adjective are human beings who care, who love deeply, who contribute amazing things to this society. You're not even aware of the things that trans, non-binary, queer people across this province have contributed to in significant ways in this province. And so, just really get to know the human behind the labels, because I would say it's very difficult, if not impossible, to discriminate against somebody that you like, that you have a real human connection with. And that's my challenge to everybody, is to go beyond the headlines, behind the labels, and get to know the humans who are directly impacted by this and start to care about them.
I can't think of anything that I would dare to add on top of that. So, Marnie, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. I want to sincerely say thank you for trusting us to have this conversation, because with the amount of misinformation, disinformation, outright lies that is being perpetuated from so many different corners, I have no illusions that it's got to be incredibly daunting to engage in any capacity. So I want to thank you so much for taking the time to chat today. And I hope that we'll be able to chat again going forward, because this issue is certainly not going away anytime soon. And we're not going to stop over here at the show. We're not going to stop talking about it. We're going to talk about those other issues like healthcare and education that you talked about as well, but we're going to do our best to make sure that this doesn't conveniently fall by the wayside for the people who want it to.
I appreciate that, Nate, and I know even agreeing to be on a show like this puts a target on my back, and it's risky. It's anytime you're visible as a trans person, it's risky. And then when you're speaking in the way that I am with the platform that we have here, I'm well aware of that. But at the same time, I've got these privileges, and I think it's important that for anybody out there, when you find yourself in a position of privilege, to be able to speak out to do so because people need you. So thanks, Nate.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Marnie.
My pleasure.
And that's it for another episode of The Breakdown. As always, if you appreciate the kind of content that we're trying to produce here, we would love nothing more than if you thought about signing up to be one of our Patreon sponsors at www.patreon.com/thebreakdownab, where for just the price of a fancy cup of coffee a month, you can help us continue to produce this kind of content. Whether you're listening to the audio version of the podcast, in which case, maybe leave a review and a rating, or whether you're watching it on one of our streaming platforms, we want to say a big thank you to everybody who is part of the Breakdowns audience. And as always, take care of each other and keep the conversation going.